Let's sew palazzo pants. This is a free pattern from Tiana's Closet. It includes a fly front closure and inseam pockets, two elements which you can easily apply to many other pant patterns. I've even added a fly shield for a more professional finish, and I give the dimensions within the video. I cut my waistband piece about 4 inches longer than the original pattern piece to accommodate for this fly shield. Join me as we sew these pretty pants step by step. Let's get started. Here are the wrong sides of both of my front pant pieces, and I'm going to pin my darts. Now I'll sew the darts from the top to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so I can tie them in knots. Press your darts toward their respective side seams. Then repeat that process to pin, sew, and press the darts in your back pant pieces as well. Now for the wrong sides of the front pant pieces once again, I've cut 2 pieces of interfacing to fuse to those fly extensions. Cutting these pieces so that the curved edges line up exactly with the curved edges of the pant, and the straight edges line up exactly with the center front as transferred from your pattern piece. Fuse in place. Now I'm going to finish the raw edges from the top of the pant to the bottom of the crotch curve. If you're using your serger, you can disengage the blade so that the machine doesn't cut off any fabric, especially at these inner corners. Now I'll place my front pant pieces right sides together, and I'll pin in place straight down from the center front to the bottom of the crotch curve. About 1/2 inch from the bottom of the interfacing, I'm going to mark a dot. Since the straight edge of the interfacing designates the center fronts of my pant, I'm going to baste from the top straight down to the dot using the longest stitch on my machine. Then I'll switch to my normal length stitch and backstitch to secure, continuing to stitch with a pattern seam allowance to the bottom of the crotch curve. Now we'll open up the front pant pieces away from each other and press open the fly extensions as well as the crotch seam. Now that I have that pressed open, place the left front pant piece underneath the right. With my fly extension still opened out flat, place my zipper right sides together so that the bottom stop of the zipper aligns with that 1/2 inch marking I placed above the interfacing at the bottom earlier. And the straight edge of my zipper will line up with the center front seam. Pin in place along the outer edge of the zipper tape. Using my zipper foot, I'll sew from the top to the bottom of the zipper on that pinned side, sewing close to the zipper teeth. Now that this side of the zipper is sewn, I'll flip this fly extension underneath itself along the stitching line we just created, and give that seam a good press. Now from the top to the bottom of this same fly extension piece, we'll edge stitch close to the zipper teeth on the same side, top stitching along that fly extension edge. Now I'll turn both of my pant legs only to the other side so that they're both underneath the zipper. Now we'll take our zipper and lay it flat on top of the opposite fly extension. And with that zipper lying completely flat, we're going to edge stitch along the opposite side of the zipper tape from top to bottom, sewing right along the edge of that zipper tape. Open your front pant pieces away from each other to the right side of the garment so that the fly extensions are still opened out flat underneath. And your zipper should be laying underneath the right side of the front pant as worn. Now I'm going to use a piece of chalk to transfer a curved line onto the front of my pant, making sure that that curved line catches those finished edges of my fly extension as I go. Now that I've drawn myself a stitching line along the right front pant piece, and I know that the stitching line will be catching the fly extension on that same side, I'm going to sew on top of my stitching line from the top, which curves to that center front seam. I like to backstitch a few times back and forth at that center front seam to secure that bottom area. As you're stitching, make sure that your opposite fly extension is out of the way. Using a seam ripper, I'm going to open up the basted section at the center front. And if you like, you can leave the zipper as is, but you could also add an optional backing to this zipper. To create a fly shield on the inside of the pant, I've cut a rectangle of fabric measuring 7.5 inches by 5 inches. I determined these dimensions so that when I fold this fly shield in half wrong sides together, the folded edge of the fly shield will sit on top of the fly extension on the right side of the pant, and these now opened edges of the fly shield will lay on top of the outer edge of the zipper. Now I'll take this rectangle that's folded wrong sides together, and I'll finish the bottom short edge and the long edges together. I'll place my fly shield right sides together with the right side of the pant on top of the fly extension, once again aligning that folded edge with the finished edge. And I'll pin the opposite finished edge of the fly shield alongside that zipper. And we're pinning through all layers, leaving this fly cover from the right side of the pant unpinned. Now when we turn this to the right side, we'll see that that will give us a nice professional cover on the inside. We're going to sew that fly shield in place from the top to the bottom, sewing right on top of those edge stitching stitches we stitched earlier. And we'll sew to the bottom as far as you can get to the bottom zipper stop. Now on the inside of the pant at the bottom of the fly shield and the fly extension, I'll sew those bottom edges together just along the outermost edge. And I'll just use a needle and thread. Now to prepare for attaching the pockets, I'm going to finish those side seams on both sides of the front pant piece. I'll also finish the entire perimeter of both front pocket pieces. I'll place my pocket pieces right sides together along their corresponding side seams, matching the notches, and pin in place. Sew from the top to the bottom of the pocket with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Press your pockets away from the pant and on top of its seam allowance, and we'll edge stitch our pockets to their seam allowances underneath, edge stitching close to the original seam on the pocket side. Here are both of my back pant pieces, and I'm going to finish the side seams from top to bottom. I'll also finish the entire perimeters for both pocket pieces for the back piece, just as I did for the front pieces. Now we'll attach the pockets to the back side seams in the exact same way as we did for the front, placing them right sides together and pinning at the notches. Sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then pressing the pockets over their seams, and understitch those pockets, edge stitching close to the seam. Now we'll place our front and back pant pieces right sides together, aligning the side seams and the pockets, and pin in place from the top around the pocket all the way to the bottom of the garment. Sew from the top of the pant with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once we get to a 1/2 inch below the pocket, we'll sew around the pocket with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and once we've passed the seam by 1/2 inch, we'll pivot to sew the remainder of that side seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way to the bottom of the garment. Repeat on both sides. Now that I have those side seams sewn, I've gone ahead and pressed the seam allowances open. And for the seam allowance where it reaches the bottom of the pocket, I'm going to clip into the back seam allowance only, clipping that back seam allowance to the side seam at the bottom of the pocket so that this seam allowance can lay nicely flat, releasing that pocket to be nicely pressed toward the front piece. Repeat for both side seams. For both of my back pant pieces, I've gone ahead and finished the edges of the crotch curve, as well as the entire inseam on both sides. Now I'll place my back pieces right sides together, and I'm going to sew that crotch curve with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I like to sew this seam twice, the second time stitching right on top of the original stitches to reinforce the seam. For my front pant piece, I've gone ahead and finished the raw edges for the inseam on both sides. And I've placed my front and back pieces right sides together. I'm going to pin the front and back pieces together along the inseam on both sides, making sure to also align the crotch seams. Now I'm going to sew the inseam starting at the bottom of one pant leg with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, all the way around the crotch curve and to the bottom of the pant leg on the opposite side. And then I'll press my seams open. I've applied interfacing to the wrong side of my waistband piece. Now I'm going to fold it in half the long way to form a memory crease down the middle. Now that I've formed that memory crease, I'll also press one of the long edges to the wrong side by 1/2 inch all the way across. Now along the top of the pant, I'm going to cut off any zipper tape that extends beyond the top edge on both sides. I'll place the unfolded long edge of the waistband right sides together with the top of the pant, and I'll start on the right side of the pant as worn. I want to start my pinning so that the waistband extends a 1/2 inch beyond the finished edge of the pant. Then I'll continue pinning the waistband to the waistline, matching the notches. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, I have cut the waistband to be a few inches longer than the pattern piece, which will allow me to cover the top raw edges of the fly shield that I've added. So on this side of the pant, you may have more than a 1/2 inch extending beyond the finished edge of the fly shield. Sew the waistband all the way around the waistline with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then press the seam allowances of the waistline up toward the waistband. Now for the short edges of the waistband, we're going to fold those pieces right sides together. And we're going to sew in the top in line with the finished edge of the front pant pieces. Once again, on the left side of the pant, if you've added the fly shield, you may have more than 1/2 inch seam allowance extending beyond that finished edge. But for the right pant piece, we're sewing from the top to the bottom of that waistband piece in the same way, and this side should be a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now I can trim those short waistband seam allowances and trim the top corners on both sides. Now we can turn the waistband right side out and give it a good press. Now that I have that waistband pressed, the inner folded edge that we pressed to the inside earlier should just be covering the main seam line. You can pin that in place all the way around or use wash-away hem tape to base that section in place before we sew. Now that the inside of my waistband is ready to be sewn, I'm going to stitch in the ditch from the main seam on the outside all the way around the waistband, making sure as I stitch that I'm catching that inner folded edge of the waistband as I go. Now on the right side of the waistband as worn, you're going to sew your buttonhole according to the marking on your pattern piece. Then we can sew our button in place on the left front pant. I've tried on my pants to determine how much I want to hem them at the bottom. Then I'll roll my hem in place, folding it once and once again on top of itself all the way around. Once your hem is pressed in place, edge stitch close to the folded edge all the way around, repeating for the bottoms of both pant legs. And now your palazzo pants are complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Subscribe to the channel for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.